The most expensive color I ever bought wasn't on a paint swatch. It was printed on a mortgage assignment. The sharp scent of fresh exterior paint still lingered in the cool morning air when I stepped onto my front porch with a mug of black coffee. The cedar siding gleamed under the early Texas sun, warm gray with crisp white trim, exactly the shade listed on the manufacturer's label when I ordered it 3 weeks earlier. I remember feeling proud. After months of restoring the old house my father left me, it finally looked like home again. Then I heard the slow crunch of tires over the gravel in front of my property. A white Lexus SUV rolled to a stop with the kind of confidence that only comes from someone who believes every street belongs to them. The driver's door opened, and out stepped Victoria Langford, 54 years old. Perfect blonde hair that never seemed to move in the wind. Designer sunglasses. A cream-colored blazer that probably cost more than my first pickup truck. She carried a clipboard tucked beneath one arm, like a sheriff carrying a badge. Behind her came 2 members of the HOA Architectural Committee, both avoiding eye contact as if they already knew how this visit would end. Victoria didn't say good morning. She didn't compliment the restoration. She simply walked up my driveway, looked at my house for exactly 3 seconds, and slid a bright red envelope into my hand. "Wrong paint color," she said with a smile so polished it almost reflected sunlight. "You're being fined $20,000 for unauthorized exterior modifications." For a moment, I honestly thought it had to be a joke. I looked back at the freshly painted siding, then at the envelope, then at the approval email still sitting open on my phone from months earlier. "That's impossible," I said calmly. "Your committee approved this exact color." Victoria tilted her head just enough to make it clear she enjoyed moments like this. "The board recently updated the approved palette. You should have checked again before finishing." The smell of drying paint suddenly mixed with the faint perfume drifting from her jacket, and somehow that combination made the whole conversation feel even more absurd. $20,000 because someone decided gray was now slightly too gray. She crossed her arms and looked over my shoulder at the house as though she were inspecting damaged merchandise. "Community standards evolve, Mr. Walker. Property values depend on consistency." Then she reached into her folder and handed me another sheet of paper. "Failure to pay within 30 days will result in additional penalties, legal fees, and collection proceedings." I could hear birds singing somewhere beyond the oak trees lining my property, completely unaware that a grown adult was threatening financial ruin over a gallon of paint. My neighbors had started peeking through their windows. Curtains shifted. Garage doors paused halfway open. Nobody spoke. Everyone already knew how Victoria operated. She ruled our subdivision with paperwork instead of kindness, and most people had learned long ago that arguing only made the fines larger. I simply nodded once, folded every page neatly, and thanked her for delivering them personally. That seemed to disappoint her. She had expected anger, maybe shouting, maybe a public scene she could later describe during the next HOA meeting as another example of difficult homeowners refusing to cooperate. Instead, I smiled. It was a small smile, but enough to make her hesitate for the first time. "Is something funny?" she asked. "Not yet," I answered, "but I have a feeling it will be." She laughed softly, turned on her heel, and walked back toward her Lexus without another word. Before climbing inside, she looked back one final time and said something that stayed with me far longer than the fine itself. "Banks always side with people who honor the rules." Then she drove away, leaving a cloud of dust drifting across my freshly painted lawn. I stood there holding the envelope while the breeze fluttered its pages against my hand. Most people thought I spent my days renovating old homes. That was true, at least partly. What almost nobody knew was that my real business wasn't buying houses. It was buying debt. Commercial notes, residential notes, distressed loans. Paper most people ignored until it quietly changed their lives. 3 weeks later, the same woman who fined me $20,000 over the wrong shade of gray would discover that the most important piece of paper in our neighborhood wasn't her violation notice anymore. Ethan Walker, 41 years old, divorced once, happily single now, and finally living in the kind of house I had dreamed about since I was a kid, riding beside my father in his faded blue Ford pickup. My father believed 2 things could never lie to you: land records and balance sheets. He spent 35 years as a commercial banker before retiring to restore old homes on weekends simply because he loved watching neglected places come back to life. I inherited both habits. I still enjoyed replacing warped porch boards, sanding weathered trim, and rebuilding stone walkways with my own hands. But my real profession happened behind conference room doors instead of construction sites. I owned a private investment company that specialized in purchasing performing and distressed loan portfolios from regional banks. Most people imagined investors chasing flashy technology companies or luxury developments. I chased paper, mortgages, commercial notes, small business loans, the contracts that quietly determined who truly controlled valuable property. It was not glamorous work, but it rewarded patience instead of noise. Banks wanted liquidity. I provided it. Families kept making payments exactly as before. Very few borrowers ever noticed when ownership of their loan changed hands because federal law simply required a notification letter. That invisible world fascinated me. Everyone admired the house sitting on the hill, but almost nobody paid attention to the document sitting inside a filing cabinet that actually controlled it. That lesson stayed with me long before I ever met Victoria Langford. After selling a larger investment partnership in Dallas, I decided I had earned something money could not usually buy anymore: peace. I found this neighborhood just outside Austin while driving home from a client meeting one spring afternoon. Mature oak trees shaded quiet streets. Children rode bicycles without parents hovering every few feet. Wind chimes echoed from front porches. The air carried the smell of fresh-cut grass and barbecue drifting across backyards every Saturday evening. It reminded me of the neighborhood where I grew up before every empty field became another shopping center. The house itself had been sitting vacant for almost 18 months after an elderly couple moved closer to their grandchildren in Arizona. Sunlight faded the shutters. The porch rail leaned slightly to one side. The flower beds had surrendered to weeds. Most buyers saw another expensive renovation. I saw potential. Over 6 months I replaced the roof, repaired cracked stone, refinished hardwood floors, upgraded electrical wiring, and restored every original window instead of replacing them with cheaper vinyl copies. Neighbors occasionally stopped to compliment the progress. Mrs. Eleanor Brooks from across the street baked peach cobbler twice because she said anyone willing to save an old house deserved homemade dessert. Mr. Henry Collins next door lent me his pressure washer and refused to accept gas money. Those little conversations convinced me I had found the right community. Then there was the other side of the neighborhood. Every month, oversized envelopes arrived from the Homeowners Association reminding residents about approved mailbox finishes, approved landscaping heights, approved holiday decorations, approved fence stains, approved everything. The language always sounded strangely personal, as though every shrub and every flower bed represented a moral decision instead of simple home maintenance. At first I ignored it. I paid my dues on time. I attended no meetings. I believed if I respected my neighbors and maintained my property, everyone would leave one another alone. That illusion lasted exactly until Victoria decided my house represented a problem that needed solving. Over the next several days after the fine arrived, more certified letters appeared in my mailbox. Inspection schedules, compliance deadlines, administrative fees. Every envelope carried the same expensive stationery and the same elegant signature at the bottom: Victoria Langford, President. It almost felt less like community management and more like a subscription service nobody had requested. I carefully filed every document inside a leather binder in my office, arranging them by date instead of emotion. My assistant, Claire, noticed the growing stack during our weekly portfolio review and raised one eyebrow. "That is a lot of paperwork for one paint job," she said. I smiled, closed the binder, and looked through the office window toward downtown Austin shimmering in the afternoon heat. "Paper has a funny way of leading people exactly where they never expected to go," I replied. At the time, Victoria believed she understood paperwork better than anyone else in the neighborhood. She had absolutely no idea she had just introduced herself to the one business where paper was the only thing that truly mattered. The first official board meeting after the fine felt less like a neighborhood gathering and more like a carefully rehearsed performance. The clubhouse smelled of fresh coffee, lemon furniture polish, and expensive candles burning near the entrance. Every folding chair had already been arranged in perfect rows facing a polished wooden podium with the Homeowners Association logo carved across the front. Residents filtered in quietly, greeting one another with polite smiles that faded the moment Victoria Langford entered the room. She did not rush. She never needed to. Confidence slowed her footsteps. Conversations gradually disappeared as she crossed the room carrying a leather binder thick enough to look like it contained the laws of an entire nation instead of neighborhood regulations. She greeted everyone by name without sounding warm. It was the kind of friendliness that reminded people she knew exactly where they lived. I took a seat near the back beside Henry Collins, who leaned over and whispered, "Watch carefully. She always saves one public example for every meeting." Before I could answer, Victoria tapped the microphone once. The tiny burst of feedback echoed across the room before absolute silence settled over every chair. She welcomed everyone, reviewed landscaping updates, discussed the annual pool budget, and congratulated herself for maintaining what she proudly called the highest property values in the county. Then she smiled. I had already learned that smile usually meant someone else's day was about to become much worse. She opened a folder, adjusted her reading glasses, and looked directly toward me. "Our next item concerns architectural compliance," she announced. Unfortunately, one homeowner recently decided that personal preference outweighed community standards. Several people shifted uncomfortably without turning around. Nobody needed to ask who she meant. She projected a photograph of my freshly painted house onto the large screen behind her. The image filled the room. Bright, clean, restored. It honestly looked better than most of the surrounding homes. Victoria circled the siding with a digital pointer as though presenting evidence in a courtroom. "This color falls outside our revised approved palette," she said. "The board cannot allow individual choices to undermine neighborhood consistency." I calmly raised my hand. The approval was granted before the work began. She glanced down at her papers without missing a beat. Previous approvals become void whenever updated architectural standards are adopted. Several homeowners exchanged confused looks. One older gentleman quietly asked whether homeowners were notified before those changes took effect. Victoria answered before anyone else could speak. The information was available through the association website. Her tone carried the confidence of someone who believed availability and communication were exactly the same thing. Then she turned back toward me. "Mr. Walker has 30 days to resolve the violation or additional assessments will begin immediately." She paused just long enough for everyone to hear the next sentence clearly. "Rules only work when everyone follows them equally." The room remained silent. Nobody applauded. Nobody objected. The air conditioning hummed overhead, while the smell of fresh coffee slowly drifted across the tables. I noticed something interesting instead. Every board member kept looking down whenever Victoria spoke. Nobody challenged her wording. Nobody offered another opinion. They simply approved each motion within seconds. It felt less like a committee and more like employees waiting for permission to leave work early. After the meeting ended, several neighbors quietly approached me near the parking lot. Mrs. Brooks apologized even though she had done nothing wrong. Henry shook his head and said he stopped repainting his own fence years ago because arguing cost more than complying. Another couple admitted they paid nearly $5,000 in landscaping fines rather than hire an attorney. The pattern became impossible to ignore. Victoria never needed to win every argument. She simply made fighting so exhausting that most people surrendered before asking whether the rules even made sense. As the evening cooled, I watched her stand beside her white Lexus laughing comfortably with a local real estate broker and a branch manager from Hillcrest Community Bank. They spoke like longtime friends. At one point, the banker handed her a business card, and she tucked it carefully inside the same leather binder that held every violation notice she had issued that evening. She caught me watching and smiled with complete confidence before saying the exact words I would replay in my mind for days afterward. "Good relationships open every door, Mr. Walker." I smiled back, nodded politely, and climbed into my truck. She believed relationships were her greatest advantage. Sitting there with the engine quietly idling and the faint scent of leather filling the cab, I realized something else entirely. Every important relationship eventually leaves a paper trail. The letters kept coming with almost mechanical precision. Every Monday morning, another certified envelope appeared in my mailbox before the due had even disappeared from the front lawn. Administrative review fee, ongoing compliance assessment, documentation processing charge, interest accumulation notice. The numbers grew larger while the explanations became shorter. By the end of the second week, the total had climbed well beyond the original amount. and every page carried Victoria Langford's elegant signature at the bottom, like she was autographing invitations instead of financial threats. The faint smell of fresh ink escaped each envelope the moment I opened it, and I began stacking them neatly beside my office desk instead of throwing them away. Claire watched the pile grow taller every afternoon. "You know, most people would already be calling attorneys," she said while organizing quarterly reports. "Most people probably would," I answered without looking up from the latest notice. "But I have learned something about paper. The louder it becomes, the more carefully you should read it." I meant every word. Instead of arguing with the association, I started observing it. Every evening, I walked the neighborhood just before sunset when porch lights flickered on and sprinklers hissed across perfectly trimmed lawns. I noticed which houses received warning stickers on trash bins, which driveways displayed violation notices tucked beneath windshield wipers, which neighbors quietly removed flower pots or repainted shutters over the weekend without saying a word. Nobody challenged the board anymore. They simply adjusted their lives around Victoria's expectations the way people learned to carry umbrellas during rainy seasons. One afternoon, I stopped to help Mrs. Brooks carry groceries inside. As she placed canned soup into her pantry, she sighed and glanced toward the street. "She was not always like this," she said softly. "Years ago, the association mostly organized holiday decorations and neighborhood picnics. Then she became president. After that, every meeting became about enforcement." She hesitated before adding something else. "People stopped speaking because speaking became expensive." That sentence stayed with me all the way home. Speaking became expensive. It perfectly described the business model Victoria had built. Fear generated compliance, and compliance generated authority. A few days later, another board meeting notice arrived, announcing a special architectural enforcement session. Curious, I attended without saying much. Victoria stood behind the podium wearing another tailored cream jacket, speaking confidently about preserving excellence. She introduced a proposal allowing the board to accelerate collection procedures for homeowners who demonstrated repeated resistance to community standards. Resistance. The word sounded dramatic considering we were discussing paint, flower beds, and mailbox posts. Every sentence she delivered carried the same polished certainty. Every motion passed within minutes. Afterward, I lingered outside while residents slowly returned to their vehicles beneath the warm glow of parking lot lights. Victoria was once again speaking with the same branch manager from Hillcrest Community Bank. This time they laughed about something while reviewing documents spread across the hood of her Lexus. He pointed toward one page, and she nodded before carefully sliding everything back into a leather portfolio. As they finished, he shook her hand with the easy familiarity of someone who had known her for years. She noticed me walking toward my truck and offered another confident smile. "Still thinking about appealing?" she asked. "I am thinking," I replied honestly. "Good," she said. "Thinking usually leads people to the right decision." I wished her a pleasant evening and drove away. Back in my office, I opened my laptop instead of the violation binder. Hillcrest Community Bank was not an unfamiliar name. My company had purchased several commercial loan pools from regional institutions over the years, and I knew enough about community banks to understand something important. They regularly adjusted their balance sheets. They sold performing notes. They refinanced portfolios. They looked for qualified buyers willing to purchase paper that no longer fit their lending strategy. None of that meant anything by itself. Not yet. Still, I asked Claire to prepare a simple market report covering every publicly available transaction involving Hillcrest over the previous 18 months. She looked surprised, but never questioned my reasoning. By the following morning, a folder waited on my desk filled with acquisition summaries, regulatory filings, and portfolio announcements. The smell of fresh coffee mixed with the crisp texture of newly printed financial reports as I slowly turned each page. I was not searching for Victoria. I was searching for patterns. Experience had taught me that people rarely reveal their vulnerabilities through conversations. They reveal them through paperwork. Somewhere behind all the polished speeches, expensive stationery, and carefully managed appearances, there had to be a document that mattered far more than every violation notice she had ever mailed. I simply needed enough patience to find it. The report from Claire arrived 2 days later inside a plain navy folder that looked far less interesting than the information it contained. I opened it while the aroma of freshly brewed coffee drifted through my office, And by the second page, I found exactly what I had been hoping for. Hillcrest Community Bank had quietly begun reducing its residential mortgage portfolio during the previous year. Rising interest rates had changed lending priorities, and the bank had started packaging perfectly healthy home loans into small investment pools for private buyers. That was not unusual. Banks did it every day across the country. Most people never noticed because their monthly payment stayed exactly the same. The only difference was who received it. Claire looked across my desk as I continued turning pages without saying a word. "You found something," she said. "Not yet," I answered, "but I know where to keep looking." Instead of contacting an attorney about my finds, I called an old colleague named Daniel Mercer, a portfolio manager who had worked with me on dozens of loan acquisitions over the past decade. Daniel understood community banks better than almost anyone I knew. We met for lunch at a quiet barbecue restaurant overlooking the river where ceiling fans slowly pushed the smell of smoked brisket and oak through the dining room. After discussing a few unrelated projects, I casually asked whether Hillcrest had been active in the secondary mortgage market. Daniel smiled before taking another sip of iced tea. "Very active," he replied. "They have been cleaning up their balance sheet for months. Small pools, mostly owner-occupied homes. Good payment history. Pretty conservative underwriting." I nodded as though the information meant very little. Inside my head, dozens of possibilities were already beginning to connect. "Anything coming up?" I asked. Daniel shrugged. "Maybe. Nothing public yet. I heard another package could be released before the end of the month." That single sentence was enough. Back at the office, I instructed Claire to monitor every portfolio announcement involving Hillcrest while I continued living exactly as though nothing had changed. Meanwhile, Victoria intensified her campaign. Another inspection notice appeared on my front door, claiming the decorative lighting around my porch created visual inconsistency after 9 o'clock in the evening. A separate letter questioned the placement of 2 flower pots that had been sitting in exactly the same location since before I bought the property. The accusations had become almost creative. Every few days she discovered another reason to remind me that the board controlled the neighborhood. I responded the same way every time. I filed each document inside the leather binder, wrote the date neatly in the corner, and said absolutely nothing. My silence seemed to frustrate her more than any argument ever could. One Saturday morning while I trimmed hedges along the driveway, Victoria stopped beside the curb in her white Lexus and lowered the passenger window. The sweet smell of expensive perfume drifted across the warm air. "Still planning to fight the board?" she asked with a smile that never quite reached her eyes. I rested the hedge trimmer against the fence and wiped my hands with a shop towel. "I am still gathering information," I replied. She laughed softly. "Information is only useful if it changes the outcome." Then she drove away before I could answer. I watched the Lexus disappear around the corner and found myself smiling instead. She believed information existed only to support authority. I knew information could quietly replace it. 3 mornings later, my office phone rang before 8 o'clock. Claire's voice carried a level of excitement I rarely heard. "Hillcrest just released another residential portfolio," she said. "Small package. Limited offering. Confidential memorandum already available." I closed the folder containing every violation notice Victoria had ever mailed me and leaned back in my chair. Sunlight poured through the office windows, reflecting across polished hardwood floors while the air conditioner hummed steadily overhead. The timing felt almost too perfect, but experience had taught me that opportunities usually appeared ordinary before they became important. I asked Claire to request the offering memorandum immediately and schedule a call with Daniel. An hour later, the secure digital file arrived. Dozens of performing mortgages, payment histories, property addresses, outstanding balances. Nothing unusual at first glance. I slowly reviewed each page the same way my father had once taught me to read financial statements, never rushing because the smallest line often carried the greatest consequence. Then my eyes stopped on a familiar street name, Willow Creek Lane, my own neighborhood. I read the property address again, then compared it against county tax records. My heartbeat remained perfectly calm even as the pieces quietly locked together. I had finally found the paper trail I had been waiting for. The address belonged to Victoria Langford. I did not celebrate. I did not lean back with some dramatic grin the way people do in movies. I simply kept reading because experience had taught me that assumptions are expensive and documents are honest. The mortgage was current. Every payment had been made on time. The original balance had been reduced steadily over several years. There was nothing unethical, suspicious, or embarrassing about it. It was simply another performing residential loan included in a package Hillcrest Community Bank wanted to sell as part of its normal portfolio strategy. That distinction mattered. I had no interest in exploiting someone because they had borrowed money. Millions of responsible Americans carried mortgages. There was nothing wrong with that. What interested me was something much simpler. Victoria had spent weeks reminding everyone in the neighborhood that paper determined authority. Now I had found the one piece of paper she probably never imagined anyone else could own. I called Daniel that afternoon and asked him to walk me through the offering package one more time. We spent nearly an hour discussing payment histories, loan quality, servicing arrangements, and pricing. Nothing about the conversation mentioned Victoria personally. We evaluated the portfolio the same way I evaluated every acquisition. Numbers first, risk second, emotion never. By the end of the call, I authorized an offer on the entire package instead of requesting a single loan. That was important because investors purchased pools, not individual mortgages selected for personal reasons. The transaction would look exactly like every other portfolio acquisition my company completed throughout the year. 3 days later, our bid was accepted. The legal team began preparing assignment documents while the servicing company coordinated notification requirements. Everything moved quietly through secure emails, digital signatures, and conference calls. Nobody in the neighborhood noticed because there was nothing visible to notice. The loudest sound in the entire process was the soft clicking of keyboards inside climate-controlled offices hundreds of miles away. Meanwhile, life inside the subdivision continued exactly as before. Victoria drove her white Lexus through the neighborhood every evening. Another violation notice appeared on my front door, claiming my newly installed address numbers reflected too much sunlight during the afternoon. I actually laughed when I read that one. The polished metal numbers had been purchased from the same supplier listed in the architectural guidelines. Apparently, compliance had become whatever Victoria decided it meant on any given day. I filed the letter inside my growing binder and went back to replacing a section of cedar fencing damaged by an old storm. The smell of fresh cut wood mixed with warm Texas air while birds settled into the oak trees overhead. Across the street, Mrs. Brooks waved from her porch. Henry wandered over carrying 2 bottles of cold root beer. We talked about baseball, rising property taxes, and whether the summer heat would arrive early this year. Nobody mentioned the association. Nobody needed to. It hovered over every conversation without being invited. 5 business days after the acquisition closed, Claire walked into my office carrying a slim overnight envelope. She placed it on my desk without saying a word because she recognized the return address immediately. I carefully opened the package. Inside sat the fully executed assignment records, servicing confirmations, and ownership documentation transferring the mortgage portfolio into my company's name. The paper felt ordinary between my fingers. Plain white pages. Black ink. No gold seals. No dramatic language. Just contracts doing exactly what contracts were designed to do. I reviewed every signature twice before placing the documents inside a separate binder completely different from the one holding Victoria's violation notices. One binder represented intimidation. The other represented lawful ownership. There was a certain irony in that difference I appreciated more than I expected. Claire finally broke the silence. "What happens now?" she asked. I closed the binder gently and looked through the office window toward the city skyline shimmering beneath the afternoon sun. "Now," I said with a quiet smile, "nothing changes." She looked confused. "Nothing. Absolutely nothing," I answered. "The payments continue exactly as before. The servicing company follows the contract. The homeowner receives every protection guaranteed by law. Nobody gets surprised. Nobody gets embarrassed. We simply wait." Patience had built my business for nearly 20 years. Good opportunities almost always became better when people underestimated how long I was willing to remain still. Victoria believed she was winning because every week brought another letter, another deadline, another attempt to pressure me into surrendering. I let every notice arrive. I attended no hearings. I filed no angry responses. While she measured paint colors and porch lights, I quietly became the owner of the most important document connected to her home without changing a single payment, a single due date, or a single term of her loan. She still believed she understood the power of paperwork. She had not yet discovered there was a very large difference between writing notices and owning the paper that everyone else answered to. The notice for the next association meeting arrived on heavy cream-colored paper with gold lettering across the top announcing a special enforcement session. According to the agenda, the board intended to vote on escalating collection procedures against homeowners who remained out of compliance beyond 30 days. My name appeared as one of 3 examples scheduled for discussion. The timing almost made me smile. While Victoria believed she was preparing the final step of her campaign, the servicing company had already completed every required notification connected to the mortgage portfolio acquisition. Somewhere among the stack of ordinary mail arriving at her house was a professionally worded letter explaining that ownership of her home loan had changed through a routine secondary market transaction. The payment address remained the same. The servicing company remained the same. Her monthly obligation remained exactly the same. Only the owner of the note had changed. That was all. Nothing dramatic. Nothing threatening. Just another perfectly legal transfer that happened thousands of times every year across the country. Folding chairs filled quickly while neighbors whispered quietly over paper agendas and cups of coffee. The room carried the familiar scent of fresh carpet cleaner mixed with brewed coffee and polished wood. Victoria stood near the front greeting board members with the same confident smile she always wore before meetings. She looked completely relaxed, laughing with the association attorney while arranging folders across the conference table. When she noticed me entering, she offered a pleasant nod that somehow carried the weight of a warning. I returned the gesture and took my usual seat near the back of the room with a slim black leather portfolio resting beside my chair. Henry leaned toward me and whispered, "You look unusually calm tonight." I smiled. I slept well. The meeting began with budget updates, landscaping contracts, and committee reports before finally reaching architectural enforcement. Victoria adjusted her glasses and opened the familiar binder containing violation records. "Several homeowners have failed to resolve outstanding compliance matters," she announced. "The board must demonstrate consistency if our standards are to retain any meaning." My house appeared once again on the projection screen. She reviewed the paint issue, administrative fees, accumulated assessments, and recommended legal collection procedures with practiced confidence. Every sentence sounded polished from repetition. When she finished, she looked directly at me. "Mr. Walker, before the board votes, would you like to make a statement?" The room became perfectly still. I stood slowly, picked up the black portfolio, and walked toward the front without any hurry. The polished hardwood floor creaked softly beneath each step. I thanked the board for allowing me to speak, then placed my portfolio gently on the conference table instead of opening it immediately. "I only have one observation," I said. "Over the past several weeks I have learned how much this association values paperwork." Victoria folded her hands and smiled politely. "Documentation protects everyone." "I completely agree," I replied. I opened the portfolio and removed a small stack of neatly organized documents. Not violation notices, not legal threats, assignment confirmations, ownership records, servicing acknowledgments. I slid the top page across the table toward Victoria without raising my voice. "Since documentation is so important, I thought you should have a copy of this." She glanced down with casual confidence at first. Then her eyes stopped moving. The smile disappeared almost instantly. She read the first page again, more slowly before turning to the next. The association attorney quietly leaned closer, adjusted his glasses, and began reading over her shoulder. Neither of them spoke for several long seconds. The silence spread through the clubhouse until even the air conditioner seemed unusually loud. One board member finally cleared his throat. "Is everything all right?" Victoria did not answer immediately. She continued reading while the attorney carefully reached for another page. I spoke only after they finished. "Those documents confirm that my investment company recently acquired a residential mortgage portfolio through a routine transaction. One of the performing loans included in that portfolio happens to be secured by a property on Willow Creek Lane." I paused just long enough for everyone to understand that I was choosing every word carefully. "Your property." No threats followed. No demands. No raised voices. I simply stood quietly beside the table while every person in the room watched Victoria look back down at the papers she had never imagined would appear in front of her. For the first time since I had moved into the neighborhood, the woman who believed every answer could be found inside her own binder had just discovered someone else's paperwork carried far more weight. The silence inside the clubhouse stretched long enough for the ticking wall clock to become the loudest sound in the room. Victoria carefully lowered the documents onto the polished conference table as though they had suddenly become much heavier than ordinary paper. The association attorney flipped through each page one more time before quietly closing the folder and folding his hands together. No one seemed interested in the violation notices anymore. Every pair of eyes remained fixed on the assignment documents resting in front of the board president. Finally, Victoria looked up at me, forcing the same practiced smile she had worn for weeks, but this time it looked strained around the edges. "You purchased my mortgage?" she asked. I shook my head gently. "My company purchased an entire performing residential portfolio from Hillcrest Community Bank through a routine secondary market transaction. Your loan happened to be included. Nothing about your payment schedule, interest rate, servicing company, or legal protections has changed." I intentionally emphasized the last sentence because I wanted everyone in the room to understand something important. This was not revenge. It was simply business conducted according to the same financial system Victoria had trusted for years. The attorney cleared his throat before speaking. "Everything appears to be properly documented." His careful wording carried far more weight than a dramatic speech ever could. One board member leaned forward. "Does this affect the association?" The attorney answered before I could. "No. The mortgage is a private financial matter unrelated to board authority." I nodded in agreement. "Exactly. Which is why I have never intended to discuss it publicly until tonight. I only brought these documents because this board has repeatedly argued that paperwork determines rights and responsibilities." I happen to agree. A quiet murmur spread across the room. Several homeowners exchanged surprised glances while others looked down at their own violation packets as though seeing them differently for the first time. Henry crossed his arms with the faintest smile I had seen all month. Mrs. Brooks simply sat still, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Victoria tried to regain control of the meeting. She straightened the papers into a perfect stack and adjusted the microphone. "This discussion is unrelated to architectural compliance," she announced. Her voice remained calm, but it no longer carried the effortless certainty that had filled every previous meeting. "Then perhaps we should return to architectural compliance," I replied politely. "Specifically the approval records for my paint application." I reached into my portfolio again and produced printed copies of the original approval email, the submission forms, and the time-stamped correspondence from the architectural committee. These documents show the work received written approval before it began. The revised standards were adopted afterward, yet the fines continued anyway. The attorney immediately requested the file. He compared my documents against the association records already sitting beside Victoria. His expression changed almost immediately. He asked one of the board members whether homeowners had ever received formal notice of the revised paint standards before enforcement began. Nobody answered. Another board member quietly admitted he assumed the management company had handled the notifications. A third confessed he had never actually reviewed the approval timeline before voting on the penalties. The room suddenly felt different. For weeks, Victoria had spoken as though every board decision reflected unanimous confidence. Now uncertainty quietly replaced authority. The attorney finally placed both folders side by side and looked toward the board. "Based on the documentation presented tonight, I recommend suspending all enforcement actions related to this matter until an independent review of the approval process is completed." Nobody argued. The motion passed without debate. For the first time since I had moved into the neighborhood, every outstanding assessment against my property was officially paused. Then something even more unexpected happened. Homeowners began raising their hands. One resident asked whether landscaping fines from the previous year should also be reviewed. Another questioned mailbox violations issued after guideline changes. Someone else requested an audit of architectural enforcement over the previous 3 years. The questions arrived one after another, not with anger, but with genuine curiosity. People were no longer afraid to speak because they had just watched paperwork defeat intimidation. Victoria remained seated, quietly organizing papers that no longer seemed to give her complete control of the room. She never looked at me again that evening. As I gathered my portfolio and prepared to leave, I noticed the leather binder containing every violation notice still resting beside her hand. It suddenly looked much smaller than it had only an hour earlier. The documents had not changed. The power people believed those documents carried had. The weeks that followed changed the neighborhood far more than a fresh coat of paint ever could. The independent review requested by the association attorney moved forward exactly as recommended. Every architectural approval issued during the previous 3 years was compared against later enforcement actions. Every revision to community standards was matched with homeowner notifications. Every assessment was reviewed alongside the supporting documentation. The process took time, but paperwork has its own pace, and unlike rumors, it does not become more convincing simply because someone repeats it often enough. One Friday afternoon, I received an official letter from the board. The same cream-colored stationery, the same association logo, the same mailbox that had delivered so many threats now carried something entirely different. The review concluded that my exterior renovation had been approved under the active standards in place when construction began. The fine was permanently withdrawn. Every administrative fee connected to that violation was canceled. The association formally acknowledged that the enforcement process had not followed its own documented procedures. I folded the letter and placed it inside the leather binder that had once held nothing but violation notices. It seemed like the proper ending for that chapter. A month later, another meeting filled the clubhouse, but the atmosphere felt completely different. People actually spoke without looking over their shoulders first. Homeowners asked questions about budgets, maintenance contracts, and committee procedures. The board answered them instead of dismissing them. Victoria sat quietly near the end of the table rather than at its center. She looked tired, not defeated, simply like someone who had finally realized that authority borrowed from fear disappears the moment people begin reading the documents for themselves. During the meeting, she announced her resignation as president, explaining that she wanted to spend more time focusing on her real estate business and personal responsibilities. Nobody applauded. Nobody celebrated. The announcement was accepted with the same quiet respect every neighbor deserved. A special election followed several weeks later, bringing in a board made up of residents with different backgrounds, different opinions, and one shared promise. Transparency before enforcement. Communication before penalties. Documentation before assumptions. Henry accepted a position on the architectural committee. Mrs. Brooks volunteered for the landscaping group. The first thing the new board did was simplify the approval process so homeowners actually understood the rules before making improvements. Looking back, I realized something almost funny. At no point did I ever threaten Victoria with her mortgage. I never changed the loan terms because I legally could not. I never interfered with her payments because that was not how responsible lending worked. The servicing company continued handling everything exactly as the contract required. She remained protected by every law that had protected her before the ownership transfer. My business had never been about taking people's homes. It had always been about understanding the value of paper long before everyone else noticed it. One evening, several months after the meeting, I finished sealing the last section of cedar fencing behind my house just as the sun settled behind the oak trees. The fresh scent of stained wood mixed with cut grass, while children laughed somewhere farther down the street. Mrs. Brooks waved from her porch. Henry was washing his pickup truck across the road. The neighborhood finally sounded the way I imagined it should have sounded when I first moved there. Quiet, ordinary, peaceful. As I gathered my tools, I noticed the warm gray paint reflecting the orange light of sunset across the front of the house. The very same color that supposedly threatened property values had become completely unremarkable because it had never really been about paint in the first place. It had always been about power. My father used to tell me that the strongest people in business rarely needed to raise their voices because contracts already spoke clearly enough. Standing there with sawdust still clinging to my work boots and the evening breeze carrying the familiar smell of fresh cedar through the yard, I finally understood exactly what he meant. Justice does not always arrive with dramatic courtroom speeches or flashing cameras. Sometimes it arrives inside an ordinary envelope, printed in black ink on plain white paper, signed by the right people, filed in the right order, and backed by patience instead of anger. Victoria believed paperwork gave her the power to control her neighbors. In the end, the very thing she trusted most became the reason everyone finally started asking better questions. And that is a lesson no paint color could ever cover.